Hello, and thank you for joining us today. Sort of an odd experience presenting a panel discussion, but I can't see anyone's face, so, but I know that you can see ours. My name is Felice Stadler, and I'm Vice President of Political Affairs here at Environmental Defense Fund. And I'm excited to welcome you to our panel discussion today as part of Climate Week 2020. Today's panel, titled Recharge America, Zero-Emission Trucks and the Low Carbon Future, focuses on a critical pillar of our economy and our transportation sector, namely the movement of goods and cargo in the United States via delivery trucks and tractor trailers. While they account for only 4% of all vehicles on US roads today, they are responsible for nearly half of all smog-forming pollution and nearly 60% of soot pollution, and about 7% of all climate warming pollution. And these emission numbers are projected to rise over 25% by 2030. The public health threats of diesel pollution are well documented, and they hit disadvantaged communities hardest because of their proximity to distribution centers, port facilities, and other transportation hotspots. Addressing pollution from this growing sector is of paramount importance. Additionally, with fuel use and miles traveled increasing year over year, having a realistic chance to stop climate change will require transitioning to zero-emission trucks. Making this happen will depend on strong policies coupled with a significant commitment by truck manufacturers and fleet owners. In other words, a true public-private partnership. Today's panel lays the foundation for this important conversation for policymakers, public health advocates, and company executives. I have the pleasure of welcoming and introducing you to our esteemed panelists, who will each cover a key component of this issue, from why it's urgent, the role of community and public health advocates in pushing for policy change, the experience from state policymakers, and the perspective from a major truck manufacturer. First, we will hear from Tim O'Connor, who is a senior director and senior attorney from EDF's energy program. Based in California, he currently leads the organization's strategy on energy transitions, focused on reducing fossil fuel use and dependence in heavy and medium duty truck transport markets. Since joining EDF in 2007, he has been working on climate and clean energy initiatives with a particular focus on oil and gas production and delivery, clean energy, transportation fuels, and clean vehicles. Then we will hear from Dr. Bakia Nelson, who's the Executive Director of Air Alliance Houston, a nonprofit advocacy organization working to reduce public health impacts of air pollution and advance environmental justice. Previously, she led a consulting firm focusing on advancing health equity and worked in Harris County's Public Health Office, where she was responsible for leading community health initiatives to reduce environmental inequities. She is also a contributing faculty member with Baylor University's Department of Public Health. Next, we will hear from Coralie Cooper, who's the Deputy Director of NESCOM, the Clean Air Association of Northeast States. She brings to NESCOM a background in motor vehicle emissions control technology and policy and building energy efficiency. As Deputy Director, Coralie assists in overseeing day-to-day operations, represents NESCOM and its member states in national forums, and coordinates aspects of NESCOM's mobile source program. And last, we will hear from Chris Nord, who is Senior Director of Advanced Vehicle Technology and Energy Products of Ryder System Incorporated. Chris is responsible for executing Ryder's growing portfolio of emerging technology solutions, as well as extending Ryder's leadership position in the advanced vehicle technology industry. His responsibilities include identifying new technologies that would enhance and improve Ryder's current product and service offerings to external customers and the general marketplace. After each will share their opening remarks, we will open it up for questions and discussion with the audience and with panelists. So please use the Q&A button on your screen to share your questions. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Tim.
Great, thank you, Felice. And for those of you on the West Coast, good morning. For those of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. And for those of you across the world, good evening. My name is Tim O'Connor. I work for the Environmental Defense Fund. As Felice said, I'm a senior director with the energy program at EDF, where I direct our energy transition strategy. And a core component of this strategy is around transitioning the transportation sector in the United States and across the world to a lower emitting, more environmentally sustainable system. And part and parcel of this is the transition that needs to happen in the medium and heavy duty truck market. Not only does this reduce emissions of climate change gases, which are imperiling states like California, as we see every day with the fires that have been ravaging the state, or with the storms that have been forming in record number across the Atlantic and threatening the eastern and southeastern seaboard. We see also, of course, that this is an important strategy for reducing air pollution, not just here in California, but in places across the world, like in India, where we have air pollution, which is wreaking havoc on people's lives, much of that because of the growth of heavy-duty transportation, and in places like London and China. And we know that what we do here in the United States matters, not just, of course, for us here at home, but across the world. And so we see this strategy as something which is about aligning America's vision and leadership with responsibility for our future and for our present. And as we do this, we can grow good jobs, both in the manufacturing and distribution, but we can save companies money, we can save human lives, and we can, in some level, save our planet's future. And so I'm going to have a brief presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bakia Nelson, who's going to drill down a little bit more on some of the items that I'm going to talk about and some of her items as well, because we share many areas of mutual concern. And I'm going to share my screen. Excuse me one moment. This climate week that's happening right now couldn't be happening at a more important time. As we see the world over, and in places that have been impacted even hardest, the impact of trucks and buses from the heavy duty sector have both a global footprint and a very local footprint. Environmental Defense Fund in 2016 and 2017 was involved in identifying some of this local footprint in places like Oakland, where we can see how Oakland, California, where we can see how trucks that travel the roads in Oakland not only emit carbon dioxide emissions of almost 23 pounds of CO2 emissions per every gallon of diesel fuel they burn, but they also are responsible for significant amounts of particulate emissions that causes respiratory distress like asthma, and nitrogen oxide emissions, which also forms respiratory distress, but also creates ground level ozone. And when we add up these effects, we see that large industrial operations that attract trucks, things like ports and rail yards and warehouses, these facilities and the truck traffic associated with it impacts communities where they live. And so while we at Climate Week are focused on saving the future and reducing emissions now so that we can achieve climate stability and avoid the worst impacts, we also see that in many of these communities that are suffering from the health impacts, this is a matter of life and death today. And so our effort around transitioning the global truck and bus market is a two-prong effort aimed at reducing climate emissions and the local health impacts associated with them. And we could see, of course, this isn't just a US initiative, a US need. We did mapping in London in 2019 and identified very similar themes to that which we found in Oakland and which we're seeing in Houston and which we're seeing in New York. That arteries of transportation and the communities that live near them are impacted first and worst from the pollution that's coming from trucks and buses. And globally, diesel emissions are responsible for about 385,000 deaths per year. It's a tremendous number to wrap your head around. Of course, in the COVID crisis, we're starting to get used to some of these huge numbers. But what we've seen also is that the science is quite clear that this pollution that not only in and of itself causes premature death, it makes people more susceptible to things like COVID infection and the worst health impacts that accrue from it. And when we look at the solution that needs to be engaged and to be developed, we see that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the panel of experts across the world that have come together to develop the strategies and the long-term trajectories with which we need to meet. In order to achieve the climate stability, we need to have a global economy which is really net zero, doesn't produce extra carbon emissions by the year 2050. And by the year 2030, we need to see about a 45% decline in those emissions. And so when we look at how the truck and bus sector can contribute, and we've done modeling to identify what indeed can be done, we find that by 2030, we need to see about 30% of new vehicles being purchased and sold for use today in the United States to be zero emissions. So this includes buses, this includes both in school bus market and in the transit bus market. This includes work trucks like beer trucks and package delivery trucks and regional haul, things that take goods from things like the ports and bring them to warehouses. And when we add all these up, we see that there's a tremendous amount of growth opportunity, but also a large challenge. And that challenge is daunting, but we think it's achievable. So we've done, and I developed this graph for use today, we've done some modeling that identifies what the sector needs to do in order to hit this IPCC goal, this getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And if we look at what we need to do, we need to pretty much have the fleet of vehicles on the road be zero emissions, not be burning diesel and contributing 23 pounds of carbon dioxide per gallon used. We need those miles to be coming to us in a non-impactful, sustainable manner. And what that means that by the year 2040, we need pretty much all sales, all new vehicle sales, to be zero emissions, so that that global fleet can transition over those 10 years to hit that goal. And if you look at what we need to do to achieve that 100% sales target in the year 2040, that by the year 2030, this 30% sales target is what we think is the growth trajectory, the target that needs to be hit. And how are we going to do that? Because you can see today in the year 2020, we're pretty much at zero. 0% sales or less than one of total annual sales in the United States of medium and heavy duty trucks are zero emissions. But with new models coming on board nearly monthly, with new partnerships by major manufacturers, with new entrants like Tesla and others that are developing and deploying vehicles. Just today, with Walmart having committed to transition its entire fleet over to zero emissions in this time frame, we see that this is achievable. And the growth curve really starts to accelerate around the year 2028. And while these new vehicles are increasingly on the road now, and while policies are being developed to help them accrue, we need to be working today to get that growth rate up, to be accelerating, so that between the years 2030 and 2040, we can make that leap from 30% to 100%. And as you see what the breakout of those vehicles are, of course, transit buses and school buses and drayage trucks, those are the trucks that are operating at ports, those need to be transitioned. But the vast majority of the vehicles out there are going to be in these single unit trucks that deliver goods from places where they're being imported into our economy to the places where they're ultimately going to be distributed. And of course, big rigs and long haul trucks, that's the marquee truck that people think about. They are, of course, a part of this. But the vast majority of what we're looking at, of course, are these single-use trucks. And there's a number of solutions out there that we think can accomplish this. And when EDF looks at the goal of that 100%, with a 30% target by 2030, we really see two sides of these solutions. One is strong public policies and programs to create a drive and to create momentum to both require lower emission vehicles to hit the market and to require some of the uptake of these vehicles, but also to develop new mechanisms to make it easier for companies to purchase these vehicles and to charge them and for the grid to handle those. These are policies and programs that the government can develop and should be developing. And also, we need corporations to commit to making investments into deploying those vehicles. Companies like Walmart with their announcement today, or companies like Ryder that is taking a leadership position. You'll be hearing from Ryder later today about how to incorporate zero-emission vehicles into their fleet. And when we have these two sides intersect, public policies and programs and corporate investments and commitments, that's where we have zero-emission vehicles hitting the road. And that's where we see the solution set. There's a identified problem in this market. It's called a chicken and egg problem. Many companies, they don't want to invest if they don't think the vehicles are going to be there and they're going to meet their obligations. And many of the manufacturers, they don't want to invest in changing their production if they don't think the purchases are going to be there. And so policies and corporate leadership, these are the things that break this chicken and egg problem. And as we see in the United States landscape, where is this likely going to happen? We've done some mapping to identify the areas of the United States that are likely to see and likely to need these zero-emission vehicle deployment, where these policies and these corporate commitments are really going to take hold, and where the vast majority of that 30% initiative is likely going to start to bear fruit. And so we've mapped where the highest ozone concentrations are in the United States, what the highest, the largest metro areas, what areas have the largest ports and intermodal rail yards, and where there's the largest transit agencies. And you can see some of America's largest metropolitan regions, from the West Coast and San Francisco and Oakland and Los Angeles, across the country to Denver and Dallas and Houston, and making its way to the east in Atlanta and New York and New Jersey and Baltimore. There's epicenters of activity. And as we focus on deploying, these are the areas that are going to both experience, we think, the highest amount of upside opportunity and the biggest benefits, where you're going to start to see air pollution reductions happen first, and where we're going to see the companies really start to accrue. Now, there's other places across the country where these vehicles are going to originate, where they're going to be deployed, and there's going to be benefits, we think, in jobs and emission savings and economic savings across the landscape. But it really is these state and federal policy and corporate investments that are going to drive these opportunities and benefits across the United States. So I'll stop us here, and I'll join you again for the Q&A, and I'll turn it back over to the moderator to continue the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Wait for you to
Yes, thank you.
share your slide. Thanks, Tim. And now we will turn it over to Dr. Bakia Nelson.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. Airlines Houston is a research-based nonprofit organization that works in partnership with communities that are unequally burdened by the public health impacts of air pollution, really to advocate for public policies that improve air quality, promote public health, and also advance environmental justice. And so really, our organization believes everyone has a right to breathe clean air, and where you live should not determine your health. And we work with a variety of communities, and I'm here today really to talk about to really drill down on some of the things that Tim talked about, to show how this really plays out at a community level when we're talking about a transition to zero emissions trucks because of the cumulative impacts that multiple sources of pollution have on communities in the Houston region. So just to provide you some broader context on the transportation sector in Houston, 47% of greenhouse gas emissions in the Houston region currently come from the transportation sector, and the population is expected to grow with 61% more vehicles on the road by the year 2045. Our region has also never met national ozone standards, and so this continues to be a regional public health threat. And I think it's also important to note that transportation emissions are not occurring in a vacuum. And so the same communities that are being disproportionately impacted from exposure to diesel particulate matter from trucks are many times the very same communities that have an overconcentration of hazardous facilities. And so it's important that we keep in mind that the trucks are only one exposure, and they're likely having multiple exposures. And I'll get in, drill down more on that later. So just quickly, the public health impacts from diesel particulate matter, which I know was talked about a little bit before, but just to go over some of the main impacts. Particulate matter that we're talking about from diesel emissions is really fine particulate matter, which is not visible to the naked eye and can be breathed down into your lungs very deeply and contribute to health impacts such as cancer, trigger asthma attacks, and so on. So just to put that into context, 70% of the total known cancer risk related to air toxics in the state of California is attributable to diesel particulate matter. So we're talking about very significant health risks that are associated with these exposures. And then really, again, the cumulative impacts from multiple exposures at the community level. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the Fifth Ward community who we work with closely in the Houston region, just to give you a community perspective of the potential benefits that a community that is overburdened with both industrial and traffic-related pollution could benefit from. So you're looking at a map of the purple outline here is the greater Fifth Ward area. And the other lines that you're looking at is the average daily traffic vehicles per day. And the darker the color, the more vehicles per day that's traveled through that community. So again, the purple line is the greater Fifth Ward. And as you can see, there are multiple traffic arteries that are going through this community, directly through the community. And then going back to my previous point about keeping in mind the intersection of the exposure to traffic pollution in addition to the exposure to pollution from facilities in the greater Fifth Ward area, what you're looking at on this map, these dots represent different industrial facilities. And within a mile of this border, we've got 12 major sources of air pollution, 30 minor sources of air pollution, 14 toxic release sites, 6 concrete batch plant facilities, 18 metal recycling facilities, 4 Superfund sites, and 2 solid waste facilities. So again, and you can see here on the right-hand side, this is a very recent finding, and this is actually something that is current and going on right now, that a cancer cluster in Fifth Ward has been confirmed by the State Department of, by the Texas Health Department. And so these are the very real impacts that come from these unequal exposures to air pollution, and why it's incredibly critical to make that transition to zero emissions trucks. And so I'll just give an example. So concrete batch plants is one type of facility that I mentioned can be found in Fifth Ward. And just to give you some perspective on that, the maximum amount of trucks that could come from just one concrete batch plant facility in a community is 600 to 750 trucks a day. And it's also important to note that air permits in the state of Texas does not consider emissions from truck traffic when they're considering the air, giving the air quality permit. So there's a whole host of air emissions that are not accounted for when an industrial facility comes to a neighborhood, in addition to the fact that they already have multiple facilities. So you've got the traffic from 600 to 750 trucks per day from just one facility. So if you multiply that times 6 in this case, you can imagine what the air pollution in this community can look like on a daily basis. And that's just from one type of facility, just to give you some perspective. And then look from another perspective, Bruce Elementary School is outlined here in the orange, with the orange border. And what you're looking at is its position relative to I-45, another highly trafficked roadway in the Houston region. And there's actually an expansion being planned, and what you're looking at here on this edge of the border is that the school would be moved even closer to that border. And so when you hear things, or when you hear people say that communities of color and lower income neighborhoods are facing kind of multiple threats and multiple burdens, this is an elementary school. And this school has also been found through research at Rice University to have an increased rate of asthma-related emergency services utilization already. So the community is already experiencing the health impacts. You can see from the study that was done by EDF, these are some of the health outcomes that are associated with some of those exposures: higher rates of asthma, higher rates of COPD, heart disease, and so on. And then ultimately, what leads to this significant gap in life expectancy. And just to put this number into perspective, the average life expectancy for the United States overall is about 78 years. Anything underneath that is considered a premature death. So we have this community living on average 69 years. So that puts the critical need and urgency behind why transitioning towards zero emissions trucks is so critical from a community perspective, and why we need to really advance the political will towards making this a reality. So these are just some of the policy recommendations that from our perspective could be done. Having more aggressive emissions-based performance measures, incorporating health impacts into state-level transportation planning, doing much more to pave the way for mass electrification. An example of this would be to incorporate electric vehicles into state implementation plans as a mitigation strategy. Leveraging the city and the county to use their power to influence the port to make electrification a priority. And then another idea is to leverage air permits as an incentive for owners to electrify their fleets. And so with that, I will stop there.
Thank you, Bakia. Next, we will hear from Coralie Cooper from NESCOM.
Thank you, Felice, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Do you see my presentation? Perfect, thank you. Okay, my name is Coralie Cooper, and I'm from NESCOM, or the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. and I'm going to talk today about policies to spur the market for medium heavy-duty electric vehicles. And so first, a bit about NESCOM. NESCOM is a regional nonprofit association of state air quality agencies in the Northeast. So you can see a map there. There we have 8 members, 6 New England states, and New York and New Jersey. And our purpose is to provide scientific, technical, analytical, and policy support to the states as they develop their air pollution control programs and their climate programs as well. And I'm going to be talking specifically about how state action is needed and can spur the market for medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. And I'll talk about specific policies. But first, I just want to kind of underscore what Bakia and Tim mentioned. Well, they actually detailed, they made a strong case for the need to reduce heavy-duty truck emissions and the health impacts associated with emissions. And so what I'm showing here is a perspective from the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, and it shows truck and vehicle counts from the period of February through the end of June of this year, so spanning the COVID shutdown. And in blue, we see total vehicle counts, and then in red, we see truck counts. And if you look around March 16th, you'll see that's when the shutdown begins with a 50% drop in overall vehicle counts. But truck traffic in red continues, and even there's a slight uptick there. So trucks continue to their activity as normal, maybe increase with more deliveries. And at the same time, air quality monitors in the region showed that air pollution was not meeting the federal air quality standards. So I just want to emphasize the need that to reduce diesel emissions and the importance of putting in place policies. So I'm going to talk about policies in the context of a specific action that 15 states plus the District of Columbia recently undertook. Just a month or two ago, 15 states plus DC signed a memorandum of understanding to promote and establish market enabling programs for medium and heavy duty ZEVs. And this initiative builds on a light duty zero emission vehicle initiative begun in 2013, where the governors also signed a memorandum of understanding to promote light duty vehicles. And they put in place a number of policies which I'll talk about and which we can borrow from when we look to the heavy duty sector to create policies to foster a market for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So the zero emission memorandum of understanding calls for 30% of new truck and bus sales to be zero emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And then it also emphasizes the need to accelerate deployment of zero-emission trucks and buses in disadvantaged communities. So Bakia mentioned the Fifth Ward and the overly burdened community and the health impact. So also in the Northeast, there are disadvantaged communities, and this MOU aims to promote ZEVs in the communities and reduce emissions. And an important thing is that the MOU directs the development of an action plan with specific policies that the states will consider and adopt, and they're going to be developing that over the next 6 months to a year. So I'm going to talk about the specific policies now, and I just want to mention that it's really, I'm going to put it into 3 buckets for the types of policies. And the first bucket is to make sure that we have product availability for medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles. Do we have the transit vans? Do we have the long haul trucks? Do we have the garbage, the refuse trucks, and all the other types, utility bucket trucks that are needed? And then also, do we have demand from the fleets? That's very important. So to ensure that manufacturers.
Sorry, can you go use presentation, do a slide, put this on slide presentation so the participants can read your slides easier. Just go into slide presentation. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so making sure that we have product availability, and then also making sure that there's market demand. So the fleets are purchasing medium heavy duty ZEBs. Um, and, and so, that in turn allows the manufacturers to plan for their product development. So a few ways that we want to think about policies to create product availability and market demand. One, there are rules for procurement of vehicles, such as bus rules requiring zero emission vehicles. California has a number of rules in place that other states can adopt. And then there are a number of states outside of California that also have procurement rules. Connecticut has a 30% transit bus requirement by 2030 for zero emission vehicles. And the New York City fleet is transitioning to entirely zero emission vehicles by 2040. So those are examples that could be expanded to other states and jurisdictions. And then California has its advanced clean trucks regulation, which requires that manufacturers produce a certain percentage of zero emission vehicle trucks and buses. And so those regulations can be adopted by other states. And that is done on an individual basis. States consider that individually. And so transitioning the public sector fleets to zero emissions is a very important way to kind of create that pull from the fleets for zero emission vehicles. And then I want to turn now to ways to reduce vehicle cost and infrastructure costs, because that's an important barrier for adoption of vehicles. I'm just going to switch to this slide for a moment. So what we have here is a study that was done by ICF for the California Electric Transportation Coalition. It's just one slide. They did a number of analyses looking at the total cost for ownership of heavy-duty vehicles, including the purchase price and the cost of fueling over the life of the vehicle and the cost of the infrastructure. So if we just focus on the left two bars, we see that the current diesel vehicle costs about $111,000 for a small van, like a transit van, over the course of its life. And then to the right of that, we see the electric counterpart, which costs it's about $125,000. So quite a bit more than the conventional diesel at this time. But what we see in the yellow is ICF's calculation of how the public policies can reduce the cost, the overall cost of ownership. And so that's what we're trying to get at here in these public policies, is to reduce the cost of ownership and infrastructure for the fleet owners. If you look to the right of the dotted line, you can see that the electric vehicle in 2030 has become more affordable because of battery cost reductions and operating cost reductions. And so the public policies aren't needed as much in those later years, but very important in the early years. So how can we lower that, reduce that upfront cost for both vehicles and the infrastructure, the fueling infrastructure? Well, there are a number of models in the light duty sector. So for example, they're kind of cash on the hood programs where a purchaser gets cash for light duty vehicles that I'm sure many of you are aware of. Connecticut has it's called the Cheaper program, which has $3 million allocated annually through 2025. Massachusetts has the More EV program. So these are for light duty, but one idea is to expand or create new programs that would also provide cash to help lower the upfront cost of heavy duty vehicles. New York has a truck voucher incentive program that pays for a substantial portion of the incremental cost of advanced technology vehicles. And then there are other ways, for example, relief on tolls or state sales tax. There could be, for example, there could be relief from the federal excise tax, but that has to happen at the federal level. But there are state taxes that might be rolled back. And then there's sort of non-monetary approaches where you're increasing the value of an electric vehicle. So if you have zero emission zones and the zero emission vehicles can go into the city center, or nighttime delivery where a zero emission vehicle can deliver at night, but a diesel can't, that adds to the value of the vehicle. And then on the infrastructure side, there's a model in the I-5 corridor. So on the West Coast, they're planning to put charging infrastructure from Canada to Mexico for heavy-duty vehicles. And that could be a great model for other regions of the country. That would put a charger in every 50 miles. So those are just a few ideas. There are a lot more for incentive type programs. And then I would also add that there's also innovative financing. So utilities can create a financing program where the infrastructure purchaser pays for the infrastructure over time on their bill, on their monthly bill, rather than having to pay for that all up front. So that's an innovative approach to financing for infrastructure. And then another approach might be to make soft costs for infrastructure eligible for funding. So currently, there are permitting costs and there are costs for logistics and planning around new infrastructure for fueling. And then there's training for mechanics and drivers that's also necessary. So providing some funding for those types of costs can overcome the barrier of those initially higher costs for zero-emission vehicles. And creating certainty also is very important so that we have a steady source of funding that is year to year and can be counted on by fleets. And then maybe I'll talk about one more bucket where we need to focus our efforts, and that's on rate design and rate certainty. So in order to reduce operating costs, we need to create stability in electricity pricing, and so that over time there's consistency and it allows the fleet operators to predict how much it's going to cost to fuel their vehicles. If rates are too high, then people are going to be less likely to come into the market. So things like demand charges need to be addressed. And there are a number of models around the country. California has, through legislation, has addressed this. New York has arrived at an agreement to address demand charges, and other jurisdictions are thinking about it. So we can borrow from those efforts. And there are also innovative approaches to add value to electric vehicles. So in Virginia, there's a Dominion school bus pilot where they've structured it so that the school bus district can return electricity to the grid, and that adds value to those electric buses. So there are a lot of innovative ways to think about this and policies to put in place. So those are some very important areas that I wanted to highlight, and some potential policies that we might think about putting into place. And I'll stop there, and I'm going to turn it back to Felice. Thank you.
Thanks, Coralie. And last, we're going to hear from Chris Nord from Ryder. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate being on here, and so thank you for the time and for everybody who's attending. I will share my screen here. All right. So to give you a little perspective, I figured I'd bring up this slide which talks about the way that Ryder is investing a lot in the way that the market is getting disrupted right now. And it's getting disrupted from a number of different perspectives, including vehicle technology, which is the reason why I'm on here, and I'll go into that a lot more. And when you talk about disruption, a lot of times what really happens is that the core group of services that sit behind a particular product continue to exist, but the customer interaction point is what gets disrupted. And so perhaps a new market leader will provide that new service in connection with the customer because they provide more information or more insights. And that's one of the things that's going on right now with the transition to electric vehicles, is that you need a different amount and a different kind of engagement with the vehicle because of this aspect around charging. And so we're working very closely with both new and existing OEMs on creating the interfaces that are required to provide our customers with that level of control that they now need to be able to enable them to move into this new world of electric vehicles. And so as just one example of this innovation that's taking place is a new way to actually put vehicles into customers' hands. And Ryder has developed a truck sharing platform. So think of Airbnb for trucks, where any vehicle owner can go onto this platform and provide their vehicle, and the coop will take care of contracts, insurance, indemnifications, and revenue collection and distribution for that vehicle. And so one of the interesting things that's going on is that some of the new OEMs that are out there, as well as some of the traditional ones, are considering or already using Coop as a way to put these demo fleets out there in order for fleets to start trying these vehicles, understanding the differences, and being able to do so in a way that doesn't incur significant costs. So if you think about a $70 a day rental for an electric vehicle, where you're able to bring the vehicle back to the rental site in order to charge it, is obviously much simpler than going out and buying an electric vehicle and installing charging infrastructure on your own. And so this platform enables us to do exactly that, to give confidence to the buyer that this vehicle, whichever vehicle it is that they're entertaining, does fit into their operating parameters and does meet the needs of their drivers, in order to then more confidently move forward with a larger implementation product. And the next step in our platform to support our customers going electric is charging infrastructure specifically. And so we have developed a partnership with a company called InCharge, as well as with ABB. ABB being probably the largest electrical manufacturer on the planet, and are operating in over 70 countries. I believe it's even 80 countries. And have installed more DC fast chargers than anyone else. It's a very strong partnership in order to also create as much standardization around all of our customers' installation, because ultimately this model and this partnership also supports all of our customers going forward. And so in order to eliminate variability, we've partnered up with this team. And that speeds any kind of assessment of downtime. Any kind of faults are standardized and much more easy to diagnose than from this team, in order to have that charger back up and running as quickly as possible. And the approach here is the way that we see the vehicle market going is not in hundreds or thousands of vehicles at a time. It is more in the next few years going to be 2 to 10 vehicles at a time, but in a distributed manner all across the country. So we're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of projects going on all at the same time. And so this model actually enables us to do all that through eliminating a lot of the reasons why companies go to the utility company today. And so as an example, the idea here of reduce is actually to first look at the building where you are looking at going EV, and holistically looking at the building's consumption to see what can be reduced in order to free up spare capacity to charge more electric vehicles, instead of just relying on the utility company to bring in more power. And so what that does is actually pressure you, so to speak, on greening your buildings first, in order to more efficiently bring EVs into your fleet. And so that's the reduce aspect. And as an end-to-end turnkey product, you then step into the aspect around designing, engineering, permitting, and building the charging infrastructure to support those vehicles that you're operating. And the operate aspect is around software, which is going to be, like I mentioned in the first slide, really key for all fleets that are electrifying, is to have the right tools at their fingertips in order to make this as seamless of a transition and with the lowest cost of transition as possible. And this turnkey product includes the idea of managing and applying for and gaining grant money or utility program incentives wherever they might exist across the US and in Canada. So here's some examples of installations in partnership with InCharge and ABB for Ryder's demo fleet of Freightliner vehicles. So right now we are testing an E-Cascadia, which is their Freightliner's tractor, as well as an EM2, which is their 26,000 DVW straight truck, in 2 different California marketplaces. And as you can see, the installations are very clean, well labeled, and supports our vehicles in the operations that are in, as well as future customer demos for faster DC charging products. And to talk a little bit about the aspect around software and the need that's here. So once you start scaling an EV implementation, insights into that fleet become imperative, and much more so than it ever was for diesel vehicles. In this case, there's an overhead view of a customer's site where they see each one of the vehicles that is plugged into a charger. And then through color coding, you see which chargers are actively charging vehicles and which ones are connected but not charging, as well as which ones might be down and needing service. This is very relevant for the day-to-day operation. So a vehicle or a driver manager will tell John to go grab vehicle number 27 sitting in parking spot number 5 because that vehicle is fully charged and ready to go. And this does need to be at a fingertip of drivers and dispatchers, as well as the idea that at the end of a day, you shouldn't need to go check every single vehicle to see if it's plugged in, but instead have the software confirm that that is in fact the case, so that you don't get left stranded the next morning where 1 or 2 of your vehicles were not plugged in the night before. And so that's the end of my slideshow, and I wanted to provide as much opportunity for the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for your presentations. We did get a few questions that already came into the Q&A box on whether you would be willing to share your slides. So if you're amenable to sharing those, then we will compile them and then make them available on our website. So just as a reminder for participants, if you look on the screen, there's a Q&A button. If you put your questions there, I do have somebody who's going through those and helping to identify some questions. So I have a few already here in the queue that I want to pose. And one that specifically for Dr. Nelson, but I think it would be a question that any of you could answer, which is how far do you see the trucking industry on board with zero emission trucks, whether it's at the local level from all of the data that's been collected that really makes a compelling case for why it's so critical, to the policymakers who also are looking for ways to incentivize movement towards zero emission trucks.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't have any hard data to support anything that I would say on the local level in terms of adoption in the private sector. But anecdotally, it seems quite sporadic, and you might have, some industries or some companies that might be piloting it, but it doesn't seem to be widespread by any stretch of the imagination. So,
if I may, I think that there's a number of industries that are doing more than piloting at this point, and I think it's based on the operating parameters of certain businesses as it makes financial sense for them. And so, as an example, last mile delivery is an area that makes perfect sense for electric vehicles, as it's a very significant stop and go application, lower speeds, and usually not vehicle operations that require a lot of miles. And so you're seeing very significant commitments from companies like FedEx and UPS that are implementing in the thousands at this point, as opposed to 2 vehicles at a time. And that's based on that operating environment that is actually quite detrimental for internal combustion products, where internal combustion products like to go 65 miles per hour down the highway, where they're most fuel efficient, most efficient from a maintenance perspective. And they are absolutely opposite in comparison to an EV, which prefers the inner city stop and go type environment where it's constantly getting, regen from the braking system, putting power back into the batteries, and the electric motor is most efficient in that slower speed applications. So it's going to happen in niche markets first. I think that there was a recent example in one of the slides here of trash trucks. That's another perfect operating environment for electric vehicles that very quickly moved from diesel to natural gas. But I expect the same thing to happen now, moving from natural gas into electric because of even further savings in that maintenance category.
And I would just add to that. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to clarify my response. I was more so, and I apologize, when I think of industry, I think of industrial facilities like oil and gas and metal recycling and concrete. And so I don't know that there's widespread adoption or commitments to adoption in those industries.
And I think that to a large extent, that may be because the vehicles that they require have not been available as of yet. But we are seeing a strong commitment from the OEM marketplace, both existing as well as new, to provide those products through the marketplace over the next 2 to 5 years.
And I just wanted to add that, Chris, to what you said, that certain segments are moving ahead more quickly than others. So urban buses is another example where you look at, there's a lot of product out there. There are articulated buses, there are 40-foot, many different configurations, and many different manufacturers are in the market. We're seeing a number of school buses. MAP just announced their LR refuse truck. So again, that's a promising segment. So I think those segments are going first that have the best kind of total cost of ownership, and we'll see others as the economics improve.
If I could jump in, I think also, what we're seeing is some broad and ambitious commitments by some real first movers and leader companies and leading fleets. I think the Amazon announcement that they're going to pursue 100,000 electric vehicles made by Rivian into their fleet. The Walmart announcement that they're going to be pursuing a zero emissions fleet. There are some very large players in these markets, both in the private business as well as in the public fleet space. And these are coupled with some major announcements by manufacturers that they're going to be investing in large zero emission product lines, both to keep up with Tesla, if you will, and because they're seeing consumer demand. One of the things that is so interesting about the business model, of course, that Ryder has, is that they're a company that provides trucks for other companies. And to this point, we haven't really seen companies that essentially don't own their trucks, but that lease them, really start to prefer and to pick zero emissions when they're thinking about what kind of truck am I going to integrate within my fleet. And so I think that the work, Bakia, that you've been doing, and that stat that you put out, that people living in the Fifth Ward live 9 years less on average than others, it's like unfathomable. And as those stats plus other air pollution stats where we link pollution to people's livelihoods and trucks, we're going to start to see more pressure, from the brands For example, if I'm a large seller of let's say shoe apparel, and it's clear that the trucks that I'm using or that I'm leasing to get my shoes to market, that those are causing impacts in local communities, and I have an option when I'm looking at what kind of truck am I going to lease next, I'm going to go zero. Or when you see the kind of pressure that is created when we link air pollution data to these sort of consumer and business choices, I think we're going to see a higher growth rate in that demand for these vehicles. And hopefully that does extend to the large industrial operators you're speaking to.
That's a really interesting point that you just made, Tim. And actually, there's a industry-wide dilemma or challenge that we're facing in solving that particular problem. And you mentioned a large manufacturer of shoe apparel as an example. The majority of times, these companies don't actually lease or run their own vehicles, but they actually hire logistics companies that then go to independent contractors to distribute those goods. And a lot of times these independent contractors don't necessarily have the capability, either from a balance sheet perspective or otherwise, to acquire new and many times very expensive vehicles. And so Ryder has recently put together a model that can, in concert with the apparel maker, create that solution, and are starting to get pretty excited about rolling that out to the marketplace in order to, again, help the enablement of businesses to go green in their transportation.
All right, I'm going to go to another question. This one's for Tim. Is there any reason from a supply chain perspective or technology infrastructure perspective why we can't reach a much higher annual deployment rate by 2030? Is 100% by 2040 as fast as we can go?
Well, the ambition embedded within a 30% target by 2030 is pretty high. But we do, I think, need to see deployment numbers that or higher in order to really achieve the emissions reductions that communities and the planet needs. But there are, of course, a number of barriers. We've seen the lack of model availability and lack of trucks available for purchase. If everybody that owned a truck or was thinking about buying a truck or that was hiring a truck today said, hey, I want to go zero, there wouldn't be enough trucks out there to purchase, not by a long shot. And that's because we've been seeing the investment by manufacturers tick up somewhat slowly, pursuant to that kind of chicken and egg problem I was talking about earlier. Would I want to invest a multi-billion-dollar improvement in my production line if I didn't think the trucks were going to be purchased, if I couldn't make a profit? That wouldn't bode well for my business prospects if I was a major manufacturer. And if I were a purchaser, would I commit to transitioning my fleet if I didn't think the vehicles were going to be there, or if I was worried that they weren't going to be able to meet my operational requirements? And as we've seen the cost declines from batteries, and as we've seen the improvements in the capability of these vehicles, there's both more awareness and confidence in the vehicles, as well as lower cost and higher yield for the actual use of those vehicles. And so there are some technological barriers to accelerating past a 30 by 30 goal. One of the things also, of course, we've seen is that when you look at batteries, there hasn't been really yet developed a robust secondary market for batteries, so that the back-end value of these batteries in a second life market can increase the residual sale value of the vehicles. And so there are some policies I think we need to develop, and some extra incentives and investment that needs to happen both in manufacturing as well as in secondary markets and in the charging infrastructure deployment to help make that happen. And so there are some barriers to achieving a much higher. But I do think also, climate change is barreling down upon us. And when COVID, dropped on the world economy like a ton of bricks, we saw what happened when society mobilized around solutions and the kind of investment that's going into trying to find vaccines and in testing Granted, more needs to be done, but I think that the global mobilization and strong public policy around this can yield a higher growth rate, but it's going to take a lot of effort.
Thanks, Tim. So you mentioned that there's a role for policy to also help drive this change at a faster clip. And I'm curious, and this is really to any of the speakers, in addition to what the federal government may be able to do or what states can do, are there examples of the role that county governments or city governments can play in helping to push a rapid deployment of electrification?
I want to add that I think they do have an important role. First of all, they have, municipal fleets are, there's a significant number of vehicles in those fleets. And so towns and cities can create policies to transition those fleets to zero emission vehicles, like New York has. It's transitioning all of its public vehicles to zero emission. So there's their purchasing element of, switching over the municipal fleets. And then they also have purchasing power. So in terms of where if they're projects where they're procuring services, it's possible to require or to put incentives in for contractors to use cleaner vehicles. So they have that that purchasing power as well, which they can use. I think there are a number of levers there that are important.
Yeah, there's a few interesting things that thinking about New York as an example. There's a lot of businesses that are not allowed to make deliveries or drive through the city at night because normally they would have been delivered with very loud diesel vehicles. And so allowing electric vehicles to enter the city during hours that other vehicles aren't available, you can create a different way of getting to the same TCO equation. There's the ability for cities to create dedicated parking spots for electric delivery vehicles, which a lot of times internal combustion vehicles are driving either they have two people in the truck, one to make the deliveries and the other to just circle around because there's no parking spots on that block. And so there's a number of things that these very dense urban environments can do that are kind of outside of the box thinking that will help drive adoption of EVs other than purely incentivizing it through monetary means.
And I'll also add that congestion pricing is another approach that can be taken by municipalities and to provide funds for low emission vehicles with the revenue that is brought in from a congestion pricing scheme. And then also zero emission zones within cities. That can be an important incentive for fleets to adopt zero emission vehicles.
At the local level, ports and large facilities that attract trucks, whether it be warehouses and intermodal rail yards, shipping areas, there is a strong local connection there, whether it be in the city of Los Angeles, where the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach represent the largest industrial source of pollution in the area. There is a lot of opportunity for that port, which is actually owned by the city, to improve its operations. And the 6,000 heavy-duty trucks that operate on that port, the connection, to driving investment in those trucks to upgrade, to modernize, to create new policies at the local level that can support them. I think it speaks volumes for the efforts that need to be engaged at all levels. When we look at Houston, when we see the mapping, we can connect these industrial centers to pollution that's at the local level, and the protection of health and welfare has traditionally fallen to the states and local governments to use their powers to engage, and those are also the ones that are connecting at the local level with businesses. As we heard from Chris, this may not be thousands upon thousands of vehicles all at once, but thousands upon thousands of small deployments of vehicles, 2, 5, 10 at a time, and that connection between local government and businesses, is a real strong marker here. So I think that there's a lot of policy as well as soft connection that there's an opportunity to look at.
I want to just build on that a little bit and go back to the example that Vikia shared with the batch plant. So you've got a major industrial source. They have a truck fleet. You talked about how the emissions from that truck fleet are not calculated as part of a permit. So I'm curious how the Air Alliance is addressing this. It's really a policy limitation, but how is Air Alliance addressing this? And then I'd like to hear from NESCOM, from Coralie. There's likely similar examples that you could find in the NESCOM region. I'm thinking of places in New Jersey, or you may see a similar situation. I'm curious if there's some policy responses that would be applicable.
Yeah, so we're addressing this indirectly. One way in which we're addressing it is just by fighting the permit in general. That the facility, part of the issue in Houston is that we don't have standard land use policies like zoning. And so a concrete batch plant can locate in the center of a neighborhood, which many of them are, and you can have multiple facilities in a particular community. So one way in which we're addressing it is just fighting the permit itself for facilities to be able to even locate in communities where they can cause the kind of damage to public health and just broader quality of life in general. The second thing that we've started looking into is redirecting the truck routes. So for instance, at the local level, the city and possibly the county, I'm not 100% sure on at the county level, but has the authority to establish truck routes and to divert the truck routes away from neighborhoods. And so perhaps just listening to the discussion today, one mechanism could be to incentivize it in a way of having those companies who do invest in electric trucks be able to access more direct routes to their destination, and other, dirty trucks have to go the long way around it, essentially. So those are the two ways.
Coralie?
Yeah, well, I would add that, so in the medium heavy duty ZEB MOU that I mentioned, there's a discussion of working with disadvantaged communities and thinking how to ensure that the cleanest vehicles go to disadvantaged communities who have traditionally been overburdened with pollution. So that'll be an important part of the discussion and development of policies going forward. And I think that what we've done in the past is to try and direct funding such as DERA and the other, TMAC and other types of funding to reduce emissions at some of those hotspots. So that's one example of trying to address that, like at the Hunts Point Market in New York, where they have 20,000 truck trips a week, trying to reduce idling or ensure that cleaner vehicles are going to the market. So that's one example.
So I'm going to stay with you, Coralie, for a minute. There's a lot of examples that have been shared that may help move the truck market, the electrification of the truck market forward. From your perspective, what do you think is the most important? Is it purchase mandates, standards, incentives? I know, and sometimes it feels like it's a little bit of a grab bag, but if you were in a situation where you could write one policy, which one would you be putting a greater emphasis behind that could really move this market forward at a rapid clip?
Well, so I kind of provided 3 buckets. I think they're all really important. So product availability, but also the pull from the fleets, and then addressing the vehicle cost and infrastructure cost and the rate design. But But I mean, I guess maybe if I had to just pick one, if I couldn't pick more than one, maybe I would focus on infrastructure cost and approaches to try and overcome barriers to the installation of infrastructure. Because there are a number of barriers such as split incentives where you have someone who rents a warehouse and somebody else owns it, and so there's no incentive to put in infrastructure, and the infrastructure is expensive. There are a lot of soft costs associated with that, and such as local permitting, and there are many different permitting procedures. So I think that that's one really important area to work on where, for example, states and localities can work on permit streamlining to try and reduce soft costs. They can direct funding to help with the soft costs, as well as for the hardware. You can also create shared public and private infrastructure. So if you have, for example, a bus depot that has charging infrastructure, maybe there's a possibility to share that with the private sector. And then through rate design, trying to create predictability in rates and lower overall rates.
Okay, thanks, Carrie.
Mhm.
So this is one that, Chris, you can answer, I think others as well. Tim, because you're in California, I know you'll have probably something to add to this. What utility policies and programs need to be implemented and scaled to support the adoption of zero-emission trucks? And do you see this happening outside of California?
So one of the things that I would encourage utility companies across the country to do is to implement a program where you can isolate the chargers for electric vehicles and create a different rate structure. Right now, if you're just adding chargers to an existing building and not separating them out, and you're in an area where there are demand charges, the electric vehicles can create costs beyond just the electric vehicle, but also on top of whatever the building is incurring currently. And so there is a need to separate those two out and create a separate program that is directly in line with the cost of the utility company in order to make sure that they are incentivizing vehicle charging to take place when they have spare capacity, so that it works in everybody's favor and supports the lowest possible cost of charging, usually at the times when they have peaks in production, which would be, as an example, in nighttime for most places. California being a bit of an exception because of how much solar they have. So they have what's referred to as the duck curve. But even with that duck curve, I don't see that the utility companies have truly lined up our cost of electricity for EVs with their ability to produce it cheaply during various times of day.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. The designing of rate structures that can inspire and incent the installation and operation of medium and heavy duty trucks, so that they're taking advantage of what's right with the grid and not exacerbating the problems, things that are wrong with the grid is very important. We look at the opportunities, of various companies to manage their charging. We're doing a study right now that looks at the benefit of how a company, for example, with 50 trucks they want to deploy, what they can do to both lower their bill and to their electric bill, and also operate their trucks in a way that it reduces the need for them and for the utility to invest in expensive upgrades that otherwise wouldn't be needed if they manage the charging appropriately. Similarly, we look at peak loads. When you have a whole bunch of trucks charging at once, that creates some extra duties on the part of the utility to be able to supply that electricity. And we want to make sure that there is an opportunity for that electricity to be supplied with clean energy, with excess renewable energy, where then we're really moving forward in a not just a incremental fashion, but really a leapfrog fashion, where the deployment of these vehicles really gets at the low carbon future. We do know, of course, that the size and scope of the investment and charging that is going to be needed is probably well beyond where folks have been positioning themselves across this landscape. That provides for two things. One is we're looking at replacing a system in diesel that's been around, in diesel delivery that's been around since the early 1900s. And the trillions of dollars that have gone into deploying that ubiquitous system of fuel production and delivery, we got to shift that over. And we're talking about doing that in the next decade or more. And so we're looking at a huge opportunity to invest in U.S. infrastructure that's going to create a lot of jobs, as well as stabilize the grid if we do it appropriately. So I think the utilities need to really come to the table and look at, what's the big picture here, and are they investing in going of this infrastructure, and also designing the system so that it could take advantage of those cost reductions and clean energy that otherwise, is going to be left on the table.
Orly, anything happening in the Northeast with respect to the utility companies and the role that they're playing in helping to support the adoption of zero emission trucks?
Yeah, so the utilities are, we're in a dialogue with utilities, or beginning a dialogue with utilities around the development of the action plan. But that's going to be a really important facet of the discussion, bringing the utilities together with the departments of environmental protection and then departments of transportation. New Jersey has an effort to bring those parties to the table to work on rate design and other issues. And so we'll be looking at expanding that kind of effort throughout the region and in the other states, the signatory states.
Okay, great. So I'm going to do one last question, and it's sort of it's to each of you, kind of a lightning round before we close out. And I know some of you sort of maybe have addressed this earlier, but if you could just share what you think is the biggest hurdle to moving the U.S. fleet to zero emissions, the trucking fleet to zero emissions, and how do you recommend addressing that hurdle? So again, lightning round, and if you want to take a pass, I don't want to put anyone on the spot. Feel free to do that. But
mind if I start?
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
All right. So I think for me, that one of the biggest issues that I've faced, and I've now talked to probably hundreds of customers about their EV journey, and risk allocation is at the very top of the list in terms of technology risk, right? So who's going to take care of the vehicle? What happens if the company, if it's a new OEM, goes out of business? And where does the financial risk lie? Is it on the shipper? Is it on the logistics company? Or is it on the independent contractor? And so how do you align all these risks in a way where it's acceptable based on who it is that's motivating the move? And that's something that is not in alignment based on the current methodology that most of these large companies that are making corporate based decisions about climate change and about implementing a greener supply chain. Those companies usually do not have the vehicle risk and the technology risk today. And so there needs to be a new model to help support their motivations to push further down into the supply chains. And that's something that we're hoping to roll out over the next 6 months.
Great.
So looking forward to that.
Thanks. Nakia, do you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of issues, at least that we've run into when talking about this topic from a school bus electrification perspective. Is number one, well, I guess you said one thing, but that just the general awareness, for instance, from a school district perspective, about the options that are available to them, the cost savings in the long run. And then after that, it just becomes a political will that is necessary to push it forward. So I would say those are the three things. And again, just from a different kind of school district perspective that we've observed.
Coralie?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of building off what Chris said, I think uncertainty on different levels is a really important. It's a barrier. So will it work in my fleet? Is the duty cycle? Sure, I saw it work over in that fleet, but will it work in my fleet? I need a lot of heating and cooling, or I go up and down hills a lot, or I drive really far. So, and then uncertainty about product availability, and possibly like the cost of fuel with, with rate design work needed. The cost of fuel is somewhat uncertain, and then resale value. So I think those types of uncertainties are very important to deal with, and that some of the public policies that I mentioned can get at those. And Tim had that great Venn diagram in the beginning, showing different industry and public policy and how they work together.
So
Yeah.
for me, I think as long as we're relying on industry to make the leap to sort of go and evaluate what's out there on the market, if there's diesel options and electric options and hydrogen options, and it's gonna be very difficult to imagine this this transition. We think that obviously once the zero emission options, it's very clear that they're cheaper than diesel. For anybody that just takes a plain look at them, you're going to start to see the purchasing decisions flip. But one of the ways that we can get at that is by changing the regulatory paradigm by which we look at trucks. And traditionally, we have implemented regulations that say trucks need to reduce pollution, like nitrogen oxide pollution, by a certain amount. Or we've looked at trucks need to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, or there needs to be a certain percentage of trucks that are zero emissions. And when we can, at the federal and state level, start to combine these standards, these pollution standards, so we're looking at criteria pollution that gets at local smog and climate pollution, and we bring them together into multi-pollutant standards, we get the federal government behind that, then we start to drive the production and all the investment in these manufacturers towards the options that have the best environmental outcomes and that are going to accelerate those cost declines. And that's sort of this like big picture solution, is these bringing to these multi-pollutant standards and adopting this at the federal level. We know that the current White House administration has said, we're not going to go there, right? And so, but we think that states have a role to play in terms of accelerating and supporting and providing a backstop against that sort of that idealism. And that they also, in a new administration, can start to accelerate the momentum towards a standard which can transform the manufacturing space, which will then mean that really the only options that are available for purchase are the ones that meet the requirements for both criteria pollution, that's local ozone and smog pollution, and climate pollution, and it's going to drive us towards those zero emission options.
Thank you. And with that, we are out of time. So I want to thank each of our panelists for the time of joining this important conversation today. And please, for participants, if you want to listen to a recording or get a copy of the slides, we will load that up. And you can find that on our website. And it'll be the same, the Climate Week 2020 link that we offered for the registration. So again, my thanks to each of our panelists and to all of the participants in today's conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.